Good afternoon or good morning to you all, depending on where in Australia you're tuning in from. My name's Claire. I'm a member of the EAAA board, recently joined, and very privileged to be working with EAAA on this important work on elder abuse and ageing. So I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay our respects to their elders past and present, and today I'm working from Gadigal lands, part of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge that the land on which I live, work and play was never ceded. So welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session. These sessions give our members the opportunity to showcase their work and share their knowledge and experience with a growing audience of people from the sector and community members. And it's great to see that we've got in the hundreds joining us today. So it shows how important and topical these conversations are. So some housekeeping before we begin. The session's being recorded. It will be shared with everyone who's registered, as well as being published on the EAAA website and our YouTube channel. If you have a question, please use the chat function. As always, we ask you to keep interactions respectful to both the speaker and the fellow participants. And at the conclusion of today's presentation, your questions will be presented to our speaker. If you need closed captions, they've been enabled for the session. There's an option at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And lastly, we always appreciate your feedback. These are really important sessions for us, so we will be sending a survey at the end of the webinar. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, to today's presentation. So I'm delighted to introduce today's session presented by Council on the Ageing New South Wales. Today's webinar, Ageism, the Discrimination We Don't See, explores one of the most pervasive and often overlooked forms of discrimination affecting older people in Australia and globally. In this Lunch and Learn webinar, we'll explore how ageism shows up across our communities, the systems and the everyday interactions that we experience, and how it connects with loneliness later in life. The session will consider the prevalence of ageism, including key statistics that reveal its scale and persistence, and how ageist assumptions shape the way we think about loneliness among older people. It will also examine who perpetuates ageism, from individuals to institutions, and reflect on how these attitudes and behaviours can become normalised. And I do have to say, having seen a little bit of the report nice and early, it is a little confronting, and we do need to have the mirror held up to ourselves on this. So it's importantly an opportunity to pause, reflect, and think about the assumptions we may not always recognise, and to consider how we all contribute to a more respectful, inclusive response to ageing, and how we might reduce loneliness in our communities. So I'm very pleased to introduce Gohar Yazdabadi, who will be leading today's session. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Council on the Ageing New South Wales. Gohar is a values-driven leader with a strong commitment to social causes and making positive impact in her communities. She's passionate about enabling better outcomes for older people in New South Wales and by proxy all of Australia. With extensive experience in shaping evidence-based policy and a proven track record of driving systemic change, Gohar is committed to improving the lives of older people through working together to understand their unique needs. She's pretty smart. She holds a Bachelor of Laws, Graduate Diploma in Legal Practice and a Master of Laws. She's also a peer-reviewed published author. So have a little bit of a brain crush on Gohar, and I can't wait for her to take us through the research that COTA has been doing. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Gohar Yazdabadi.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction, Claire. Really appreciate it. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet. Today, I'm meeting with you on Gadigal country. And I pay my respect to elders past, present, and future. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I'm really excited to be here talking about ageism and age discrimination. It's a topic that's really dear to my heart, and I think it's something that really gets to the crux of a lot of the issues that we're seeing and that we're facing in aging today. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank the EAAA for inviting me to speak today, and to thank all of you for taking the time to join this session. Conversations like this are incredibly important because they bring together people who are working across different parts of the sector, but who also share a common goal, and that's ensuring that older people are respected, supported, and able to live well in our communities. So today I want to explore three issues that are often discussed separately, but are really closely connected in people's lives, and that's ageism, loneliness, and elder abuse. So, over the past few years, COTA New South Wales has undertaken research in both ageism and loneliness among older people, and I'll be sharing some of those findings with you today. Um, what this research really highlights, and we'll jump into it, is that not only the scale of these issues, but also how they shape older people's everyday experiences, including their sense of connection, belonging, and safety. So today I will be exploring the three issues, which are really closely connected in people's everyday lives. So I'll start off by looking at why this conversation is important, particularly in the context of our aging communities. Then I'll move on to exploring ageism, loneliness, and the way that they intersect with elder abuse, and why it's really important that we think about these issues together. From there, I'll share some findings from Council on the Ageing New South Wales research into ageism, and then move on to our research on loneliness amongst older people. Finally, I'll be having a bit of a reflection on what these findings mean for well-being, inclusion, and safety of older people, which are so important to everybody on this webinar today. So, really, why is this conversation so important? And it really comes down to understanding that ageism and loneliness help us understand why elder abuse happens, why it can remain hidden, and what needs to actually change. So, ageism really shapes how older people are valued. When we or when society have negative assumptions about aging, what it does is normalize dismissive attitudes. It reduces credibility when older people report harm, and it really lowers expectations about the rights and autonomy of older people. So, a really good example of this is that an older person might report financial exploitation by a family member, but it's dismissed because the person just assumes that the older person just might be confused about their finances and doesn't really understand what's going on, and their daughter couldn't possibly be doing this sort of thing to them, rather than being treated as something serious and a potential of abuse. And then when we look at loneliness, it really increases vulnerability. So social isolation works to reduce protective networks. It works to limit access to support, and it can increase dependence on a smaller number of people. And that smaller number of people can often be those who may also be causing harm. So, an example is an older person has lost their partner and has limited social contact. They then become reliant on one adult child for transport, for finances, and for daily support. So that reduction in the circle of dependence then leaves them with little ability to seek help if that single person starts to control or misuse their money or something along those lines. But what's really important is that both of these things influence how systems respond. So, ageist assumptions, they create invisibility, and they also do so in terms of creating loneliness as well. And this can lead to abuse being overlooked or minimized or treated as an inevitable part of aging. So, an example would be an older person attends a service and appears to show signs of depression or withdrawal that progressively seem to worsen, and there's more social isolation. But staff assume that these changes are simply part of aging rather than considering the possibility that there could be coercion or abuse by somebody close to them. So if we've established that loneliness and ageism matter when we're talking about the elder abuse conversation, but the real next question is, how do these issues actually interact with each other? Why is it important that we're speaking about them as a whole? So starting off with ageism, ageism really shapes the way that older people how society views older people. So it shows up in assumptions that older people are less capable, less valuable, less entitled to autonomy or decision making. And these attitudes then influence how older people are treated in families, communities, and institutions. Um, but then ageism can often push older people into the margins of social, economic, or community life, and it can then contribute to loneliness and social isolation. Um, Social networks then shrink due to life's transitions, things like retirement, loss of loved ones, health changes, and what we then find is exclusion and ageist attitudes then make this isolation worse. So it's another layer upon the cycle. So within this context, we then see the circumstances allowing for greater risk of elder abuse. Abuse may be more likely to occur, but importantly, it can be even harder to detect because the older person experiencing harm has fewer connections with people that might notice the change. But at the same time, there's also fewer people to provide support and create an environment where the older person can report what's happening. So uh, the relationship doesn't really stop there. We then see experiencing that the experience of elder abuse in and of itself can create isolation and reinforce that ageist treatment, which can then deepen the loneliness and the vulnerability. So what we see isn't just a simple chain of events, but really it's a reinforcing cycle. So understanding this relationship really helps us to recognize and address elder abuse, because it's not just about responding to the harm after it occurs, it's about addressing those broader conditions, including ageism and loneliness. So really what's really important here is that this isn't just a chain of events. It's not just A, B, and C that are kind of related to one another. It's really cyclical. It's a cycle that just can spiral out of control and make bad situations continually worse. So what I've outlined is that conceptual relationship between ageism, loneliness, and elder abuse, how they all kind of fit together in the broader sense. Um, but it turns our minds to really important questions like, how does ageism actually show up in people's lives? What does it look like in everyday interactions? And what impact does it have on older people? Who's perpetuating the ageism and what impact does that have? So at Council on the Age in New South Wales, we wanted to explore those questions more closely. So we undertook a huge survey of older people across New South Wales to really begin to better understand how ageism is experienced in practice. The research involved a survey of people over the age of 50 who shared their experience of ageism in the workplace, in services, in healthcare settings, and everyday interactions. the report that will be coming out of this research is called Age is More Than a Number, and it'll be released shortly. But today I am giving you all a sneak peek into our findings because I really think they're going to help illustrate just how common and just how consequential ageism can be. And I think once we understand the magnitude of the problem, I think it helps us to understand even better how elder abuse is probably out there and the scale of which is most likely out there. So let's start off with what is ageism. When we talk about ageism, we're referring to things that that put forward a stereotype, they put forward a prejudice, or they involve a discrimination based on age. And these elements all come from the World Health Organization's definition of ageism. And what that does is it really recognizes that ageism operates at multiple levels. It's not a single way that in which it works. So we've got individual ageism, and that's at the individual level where ageism shows up in everyday attitudes, language, and behavior directly at a single person. So this might include assumptions that a particular older person is less capable, less adaptable, less interested in learning, or they might not want to participate in society. And that's really on that one-on-one basis. We then have institutional ageism. So it's where we see ageism embedded in the systems and in the policies or in the way services are provided. And it's it's not necessarily directed at a single person. It's usually a blanket sort of policy or a blanket way of working that affects many older people. So it might occur when a policy unintentionally excludes older people, or when we have poor system design, where we see that a system in and of itself is designed in a way that assumes older people have fewer rights, have fewer needs, or they have lower expectations, or it makes an assumption that all older people are capable or incapable in a certain way. We then have a really interesting aspect of ageism as well, which is internalized ageism. And ageism is so pervasive in our society that we often see it become internalized by the older person. So this is a situation where over time, older people may themselves begin to absorb those negative stereotypes about aging and about themselves as somebody who is aging, and it can affect their confidence, their participation, and their willingness to seek out help. So essentially, it's not necessarily attitudes that older people have developed when they're older. It can be attitudes that they've carried through their life from a young age about what aging looks like. And once they find themselves aging, they may apply those their own stereotypes that they've held onto to themselves, which is really interesting. So ageism isn't just about these individual attitudes, it's also about the structures, the systems, and the cultural assumptions that we have about aging. So our research involved 2,708 people aged 50 and over across New South Wales. So it gave us a really substantial picture of how older people are experiencing ageism in everyday life, and how it impacts them. Uh, the, you know, a really clear finding is that ageism is not rare. It's really very widespread. 62% reported being treated differently because of their age. That means for older people, experiences of age-based discrimination are not isolated incidences. They're not something that happens as a one-off. but they are part of ordinary daily interactions, which is a very worrying piece of information that we've got there. We also found that 40% of respondents had experienced jokes or comments about their age. And this is that sort of reflection that as a society, we feel that we can still joke about ageism or age discrimination can still bubble up as jokes. And it's really a reflection of our acceptance of ageism as a society, that we think that it's appropriate to be able to make jokes based on someone's age or make comments based on somebody's age. So these kinds of comments are often framed as, just humor or a bit of harmless banter, but they really have an important role in reinforcing these stereotypes about aging. So while individually these moments might appear minor, what we see is that they actually are occurring repeatedly and across different settings. So they contribute to this broader environment where people can feel dismissed, they can feel marginalized or less valued. And over time, those experiences can really shape how people participate in everyday life, how they participate in workplaces, services, and in community life. So really the key point here is that ageism is not simply about an occasional insensitive comment. It really seems to be reflecting deeper attitudes about aging, and that then influences how older people are treated in society and what is acceptable when it comes to the treatment of older people. So our research found that ageism doesn't just occur in one place. Ageism really is something that occurs across the board and in lots of different everyday interactions. So some of the most frequently reported sources were strangers. We also saw it reported in service environments, workplaces, healthcare settings, and it happens in the familial sense as well. So people that we love and we trust. So our family members and our friends are also partaking in that kind of behavior. So it's not that older people are experiencing this from a single source. It is holistically being applied across the board in all different kinds of settings. So it's going back to those three elements of the definition and the way that people can experience ageism. It's not confined to, say, institutions or policy settings, but instead we really see it being embedded in everyday social interactions across lots of different parts of people's lives and important parts of people's lives. Going to work, that's essential. Going and seeking services, that's essential. Having friends, having families, going to healthcare providers. These aren't nice to have parts of your life. These are really core and important parts of people's lives where they're not safe from ageism. So it's really important to understand what happens when ageism occurs. So the first thing that we can kind of look at is what happens immediately after somebody faces ageism. And what we find is that ageism is not formally challenged or reported very much at all. So more than half of respondents said that they took no action at all following an experience of ageism. And others chose to sort of speak to family and friends informally about it. And some people may have raised it directly with the person or the service provider involved, but only a really small percentage made a formal complaint. Just 5%. So there's reasons for this. some of the respondents un were not confident that what they experienced was going to be taken seriously. So they felt that they would be making a complaint and that complaint would go nowhere. So why bother? Why put the effort and energy into something that is just going to be dismissed? And looking at the pervasiveness of ageism and the level at which we think it's okay to joke about age and have ageist attitudes in that way, well, we can't really blame older people for that when it's so widely accepted in society, and so little understood in society. We can really feel for people in not wanting to make that complaint. Um, so what this really means is that although ageism is really commonly experienced, it remains largely invisible to institutions and systems, because if no one's speaking up about it, if no one's making these formal complaints, then service providers aren't sitting there thinking, oh gosh, you know, maybe we need to do something about this. This is really an issue. So it remains unseen to them. And what that then allows is for the status quo and for these attitudes to be able to continue. So when a behavior is unchallenged, as we all know, it becomes normalized. So again, we've got a bit of a cycle going on here in terms of, I won't report, it's not worth reporting, and the situation just grows and grows from there. So one of the really interesting parts about our report is that we were able to really go down into some very, very specifics here. So we were able to draw out where the source of ageism comes from and then look at the short-term impacts of that ageism and other longer-term impacts of the ageism. And what we found is that ageism isn't shaped by the behavior itself. So it's not just the act or the perpetuation of ageism itself that shapes the impact, but it is by who that ageism is actually coming from and the nature of the relationship in which it evolves from. So when ageism is occurring within families, the consequences are really deeply personal. Respondents report reduced confidence and over time, a tendency to second guess their own judgment and their decision making. When it occurs in interactions with friends and acquaintances, the impact manifests socially. So it contributes to withdrawal from relationships and a growing sense of being less valued. In workplace settings, and this is something that at Council on the Aging New South Wales, we hear about this so often. And that's that the consequence of ageism from an employer or a potential employer is very, very significant. So experiences of ageism from employers, colleagues, potential employers are associated with that short-term reduction in confidence. But in the long term, it sees people stopping looking for employment altogether. It becomes so pervasive for them. It becomes such a barrier for them. And it happens so often and continually that it stops people from looking for employment altogether. And that's really worrying. Employment is something that everyone should be able to engage with. It's important. We all need to be able to provide for ourselves. We all need to be able to be engaged in the workforce. It is essential. So when we see it impact something that is essential, it becomes hugely problematic. And then, moving on to the healthcare provider, when the source is the healthcare provider, the implications are not just interpersonal. We see older people less likely to return to that service provider straight up, to the healthcare provider straight up after following those ageist encounters. And that raises some really important concerns about access to care, especially because we see healthcare providers as being a really important protective relationship for elder abuse. We don't want to see older people feeling that they can't go and see their healthcare provider because they feel that the interaction might be ageist or they've felt that interaction with them. This needs to be a really safe space for older people to be able to have complete trust, have complete respect, so that they are able to raise those issues where they're feeling vulnerable, raise those issues and report those issues where they might be starting to feel something is not quite right in some of the relationships that they have. Um, but interestingly, even where the interaction is with a stranger, its effects shouldn't be underestimated. So just because we don't know the person who is perpetuating this, repeated experiences can really erode confidence and reinforce that broader perception of diminished social value that the older person holds. So really taking all of these sort of findings together, it suggests that the effects of ageism are shaped not just by the behavior itself, but by the context in which it occurs and by the relationship and that power dynamic within which it occurs. So they're all really important things for us to keep at the front of our minds. What's also really important to remember is that ageism is not experienced in the same way by everybody. Some groups experience ageism really differently because it intersects with other forms of disadvantage. So what we see is vulnerability stacked upon vulnerability, stacked upon vulnerability, and creating an ecosystem that's ripe for age discrimination because it brings together all of these very marginalizing situations for people. So by far, our research found that First Nations older people reported the highest rates of age discrimination, and this was significantly higher than the overall survey findings. And that is a reflection of that intersectionality between racism and ageism very clearly spelt us out for us right there. We also see the differences linked to income, not quite as profoundly, but still very clearly there. So respondents on lower incomes reported higher levels of discrimination. And we also see a difference in the way people respond and the way people internalize the experiences of ageism. So for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, we saw that they were much more likely to report mental health impacts from experiences of ageism. So we saw a lot of internalization there when they experienced ageism. This one I don't think I mean, I don't think much of this surprises anyone on here, but this statistic as well. So women were nearly twice as likely as men to report experiencing ageism in the healthcare setting. So again, this idea that one vulnerability on top of another, the sexism of women not being able to understand the healthcare context in which they are seeking help, and then on top of that, being treated in terms of their age as well differently. So, some of the commentary around it was things like, I go into a healthcare setting and I'm referred to as dear or darling, and then proceeded to be talked down, and instead of being given options to make co-decisions with my healthcare provider, I'm sort of tutted at and ignored and simply told what to do instead of in any meaningful way being part of a conversation around health. So again, these our findings highlight that ageism doesn't occur in isolation. It really intersects with other social factors such as gender, cultural background, economic circumstances, and it shapes how discrimination is experienced and how that discrimination impacts people. So, up until this point, we've been talking about how common ageism is and the impacts it can have on people's confidence, on their well-being, and their participation in society in general. Um, but what I think is really important is when you look at these findings, it's the consequences of ageism that's really key. Ageism doesn't stop in the moment that the behavior occurs. It's not simply a moment in time. When people experience ageism, and they usually experience it in a repeated kind of sense, so repeated dismissals, stereotyping and exclusion, it it affects how they engage with others in the world around them. Um, so, we've seen there people avoid returning to certain services. Um, Others withdraw from workplaces or social environments where they've been dismissed or haven't felt valued. And over time, these kinds of experiences contribute to people pulling back from relationships. It stops them from engaging in services and it stops them from participating in community life. And this is where the conversation begins to connect really strongly with the issues of loneliness and social isolation. So it really brings together the issue of ageism and loneliness and social isolation, because it is those impacts of ageism that then perpetuate into loneliness and social isolation. So people start to feel less confident, they feel less valued or less welcomed in certain spaces. And then that risk of withdrawal and isolation then increases. So I want to turn to the second part of this conversation, which is loneliness. So we did some research into loneliness amongst older people in New South Wales, and that was a survey of 2,245 people aged over 50. And I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but to measure loneliness, we use the De Jong-Gervald loneliness scale, which is an internationally recognized tool in research to assess loneliness levels. It's been peer reviewed, it's been tested to make sure that it is actually really representative of what loneliness looks like and that people who are lonely do come up on this scale. So again, our findings were striking. 6 in 10 older people reported experiencing loneliness. And that's when we asked the direct question of, being lonely. Half reported being socially isolated, meaning they have limited social contact or connection with others. Again, that's where we've asked the direct question. And 1/4 of older people reported experiencing the most extreme level of loneliness. And we'll get into that a bit more. But what these findings really do is highlight that loneliness is not a marginal issue affecting a small minority. It is a really widespread issue affecting many people, a really significant portion of the older population. But more importantly, the extreme level of loneliness is really being felt. So that really brings us into this this graph here, which shows us the severity of the loneliness. So down the bottom, we've got where people scored on De Jong scale. So 0 was the least lonely and 6 was the most lonely. And I'm just going to go through sort of giving you an idea of what the questions were to get somebody to be in that most lonely category. And I'm pretty sure you had to answer all of the questions as applying to you to fall into that most lonely category. So these questions were really about relationships and a sense of connection. And they included whether people experienced a general sense of emptiness, whether they miss having people around them, whether sometimes they feel rejected. And then it also looked into support networks, which is really important when we're talking about elder abuse. So the questions were things like, do you have people you can rely on when you have a problem? Are there people that you can trust completely, and whether there's enough people that you feel close to? So this is the responses to these are a really significant statement about a person's relationship and social world. And we can see here that 6 is by far the highest that highest proportion of people scored a 6, and that was at 25%. And then a 5 was at around the 15% mark. So 40% of people were were in this independent score, suffering from the most severe forms of loneliness that there are. And on the flip side of that, the least lonely, it's not that it's sort of polarizing on the two ends. You're either really happy or really quite lonely. It's sort of a straight scale here, and then we've got a peak at the last two, which is very concerning because it also means that we don't have enough people who are feeling that they have people that they can rely on and are in a really good place. So it I think it's a very, out of all the things around loneliness, this is I think the one graph that really stood out to me and really showed the depth of the issue that we're talking about. It's not that it's not a simple story where we are just saying that loneliness exists. It's highlighting gaps in social connection, and those gaps are exactly the protective factors for older people when it comes to elder abuse. So I think this is a really important thing for us to keep at the front of our minds. Um, the the it's important to think about the impacts of loneliness because what we often think is that loneliness simply impacts a person in terms of their mental health, and it does. It absolutely does. That's not a debatable point. It does do that. But what our research showed is that loneliness has a very practical consequence in people's lives. So around 1/4 of respondents said that loneliness affects their ability to complete everyday tasks like shopping or cooking. 20% reported that loneliness prevents them from seeking medical advice or visiting their doctor, which is particularly concerning because of the health outcomes. And 40% said loneliness limits their ability to participate in activities they enjoy or connect with. And perhaps one statistic and one finding that every time I repeat, I feel really sad about saying it, but 1 in 10 lonely older people leave their house less than once a month. And you just need you just it really hits home what the impact of loneliness is. Well, and I'm not saying that loneliness has meant that is the only factor in stopping people from leaving their houses once a month or less. But the fact that lonely old people, 1 in 10 of them leave their house once a month or less, deeply shows how impactful on a practical level this is. And all of these impacts, they're exactly the impacts that create an impact on the way that older people engage in the world around them. And that directly impacts on the issue of elder abuse as well. So it's very concerning the way that we see elder abuse manifest. So what drives elder abuse in later life? It emerges through loss, essentially. So common contributors are loss of a partner, loss of a friend, um, changes in health or mobility, making it harder to participate in community life. Um, Relocation or caring responsibilities also reduce the opportunities for connection. So, what the research highlights is that loneliness is often not the result of one event, but it's accumulation of changes over time that create loneliness. And it's very different to how we've thought about grief and loneliness, but grief and loss previously. Previously, it was, a couple of generations ago, loss and grief were around simply losing your partner. But now we're seeing a much, much, much larger circle of loss and grief, and it occurring over time throughout very differing aspects of a person's life. Uh, so it's important to understand that loneliness really affects the way people feel valued by society. So 60% of older people who are lonely rarely feel, rarely or never feel valued by society. 20% do not have someone they can rely on for support. And 32% only 32% of people feel that those around them enjoy their company. And I think that that shows a really stark internalization of the experiences of ageism, which then really interact there with self-imposed ageism as well. So, if people don't value you, if people don't enjoy being around you, those ideas around being an older person and, feeling that you're old now and dumb, you're old now and not valued, you're old now and no one finds you interesting, all increase your internalized ageism as well. So one of my favorite statistics that we've come out of this is around why older people can't or don't participate in activities and things that are out there for them. And 60% of respondents said that they do not participate in activities aimed at older people because they find them boring. So it's a real idea of uh, when we're creating these activities, what exactly is it that we're doing? Is there a bit of ageism there? Are we just assuming all older people like the same things, do the same things, and that they're a homogenous group of people, um, and and try and appeal to them in that homogenous middle of the ground kind of way? Or are we really thinking about and engaging with older people to understand and co-design activities that we think that they will actually enjoy and they will actually be a part of? So, I mean, I think it really highlights that loneliness is not just about social connection, it's about how people are perceived and included in society. And in that sense, it really does bring us back to the conversation about ageism and how the expectations we place on older people can shape their opportunities for connection. So, last thoughts. Valuing older people, it's not just about respect, it's also about connection, safety, and dignity. And I I really think that these three issues coming together in the one spot are really important for us to understand because they will shape so much of how we respond to elder abuse. So, on a final note, let's stay in touch. Go to www.codanewsouthwales.com.au. There you'll find a couple of ways to engage. You can sign up to our newsletter, or if you're a service provider, you can, or work with older people, you can uh, sign up to our bulletins. There's a for service providers section there, and you can sign up to our bulletin. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I can guarantee you I am the only Gohar Yazdabadi on LinkedIn. So I'll be no confusion there. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, Gohar, that was incredible. And the chat has been going pretty wild, I have to say. It's definitely the most engaged that I've seen, and there's quite a few questions. I was going to do some reflections, but we can just see that everyone's so deeply engaged. We'll literally move through to the questions. Now,
Sure.
there were a couple that were asking around in terms of the survey itself, whether there was any distinguishing between various age groups with respect to the source of ageism. So obviously gender and the source of ageism. But did you, to the point of,
Yeah,
it's not a homogenous group of older Australians?
that's right. So
Yeah.
ex as we would expect, people who were, because this was 50 and above, people who were in the 50 to sort of 65 age group, there was a real clear tendency for their ageism to occur in the workplace and when finding work and things like that. And
Mm,
then the older you became, it became really clear that service providers and people providing services were much more pervasive in ageism. So, when we got to sort of the 75 mark and above, we saw healthcare providers, we saw a real markedness in service providers, that ageism occurring then. But interestingly enough, the idea of ageism in terms of jokes and that
mm,
sort of banter was quite consistent across the board in terms of ages.
okay. It's such a shame, isn't it? And I do think about my mum saying, I don't want to go to that thing with a heap of old people. And she's, she's just turned 80, but she's still in her mind is, she is young and sprightly and she doesn't want to be pigeonholed and made to do things that,
Absolutely.
that someone else has designed with no lived experience. So,
Absolutely.
okay, I'm going to crack into the questions for you. So there are quite a few. So let's see how many we can get through, noting that we are 122.
Absolutely.
So Louise asked, is the fact that your children don't bother to visit a form of elder abuse?
Oh, I think that's a really, really good question. And, I think elder abuse is manifests in all different types of ways. And I think it's really important to reflect on how that makes the individual feel in that circumstance. I mean, if you're not feeling good about it, which you most likely aren't,
Mm,
while it might not be a recognized form of elder abuse or it might not be coercive control or something like that, the fact that it's making you feel not great
mm,
is indicative. But what I think is really important there is sharing that experience with the person, letting them know, not just around why don't you come and visit, but what that impact has on you. Because I think what's really clear from all of this research is that people are not attuned to how their behavior impacts other people. They might
yeah.
be completely oblivious to it. So I think that's really important. And that's the key part of that situation.
And I think your comment around we've got to hold a mirror up to ourselves. I mean, as I'm someone who's aging myself, and I know I don't look like it compared to, many on this call, but I am getting older and I am starting to feel it. And I think holding a mirror up, I'm feeling it at both ends. I look at how I treat my mother and sometimes kind of get really snippy about things and think about the impact that might have. And then also how I'm being treated as someone who's clearly not, super young anymore. And that impact is real. And I think it's the impact that we all need to reflect on, right? And our
Yeah,
role in all of this.
exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. So David asked, older renters and homeless people seem to be considered at fault for not having secure housing at their age. Could that be a form of ageism?
Absolutely. So I think that these entrenched, I think, so what I think is really important to remember here is that most people who design policies, most people who are journalists, most of these people are not over the age of 65. The vast majority of them are much younger than that. So they have no lived experience of being older. They have
Mm,
no understanding of being older. And even, you know, they don't necessarily have a lot of older people in their lives who are experiencing these sorts of things. So, what that manifests is these ageist approaches to policy, these ageist approaches to narratives, and it then perpetuates this idea of ageism throughout society. So, absolutely,
mm.
these are definitely ageist. That systematic ageism that we talk about. This is definitely one of them.
And that's interesting because one of the questions from Yolana, I think, Yolana, was asking around the responsibility of media for spreading ageism. Um,
It's highly pervasive, and one of my members came to me, and they had a newspaper article, and the newspaper article was something along the lines of boomers find a new way to torture the younger generation through housing prices. Now, if we took those two and we changed it from boomer to men, from boomer to women, and we changed Gen X to men, we wouldn't accept that title as a society. They would
mm,
have complaints through the roof on that kind of language. But somehow, for some reason, ageism is continually allowed to happen. And part of that is because of internalized ageism, where older people sometimes don't necessarily pick up on it and don't necessarily make a complaint about it because they've internalized it to such a degree.
mm.
But it definitely is one of the last isms that are appropriate, and media play a massive role in the generational wars.
Absolutely. And I think, the lived experience of people filing complaints was coming through the conversation when you were talking. And, there were some people saying that they'd tried and found it really difficult. The burden of proof was on them as the
Yeah,
complainant, and they had to prove,
exactly.
this interaction with your family. It feels a little bit like they then gaslight you, going, I never did that. What are you talking about? You're off your rocker. Or you just don't get a response. And so I really want to ask you again, change doesn't happen unless people speak up. And so what is the call to action, I guess? Like just keep going, is it?
Yeah,
Every complaint adds up, right?
absolutely. And I think going back to the mirror, I think that we all have a responsibility to hold that mirror up to ourselves. We all have a responsibility to check our own behavior because, even working in this role, it still pops up in my life. And as me as the perpetrator of that ageism,
Mm,
and I have to pull myself up on what I'm doing and rethinking it. But I want older people to hold that mirror up to themselves as well and think, have I internalized this ageism? Do I need to change something? And then I guess the next step from that is we need to we need to be really vocal. We need to make those complaints. We need to, step up and speak up. It is arduous. It is difficult. It is confronting. It can be embarrassing, but it's
mm,
important for us to do it for ourselves, but also for others when we see it happening. In that context, we need to be doing it. When you see the media being ageist, we need to write to the editor and clearly spell it out for them. We need to be able to do that as a society.
mm. Okay, look, we are coming up to time. I'm going to close with a couple of counter provocations here because I think the chat has just been so interesting. And so we had one person say we have to consider the other side of the coin, so to speak. A lot of older people become complacent about taking up new things, such as learning basic computer skills, which are essential in today's world. Does this lead to or contribute to ageist attitudes? And then the other one was, some of us think boomers are probably one of the most privileged generations, past or present. Would you consider that ageism or jealousy? I'm not going to put you on the spot with that, but I think it's really great to see that there's multiple perspectives coming through on this chat. Ageism is obviously a big deal. However, it's never cut and dry. It's never binary, right? And so it's, to your point, the people themselves, we have to reflect on the roles that we play individually. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think we'll end up wrapping up here. Now, there were a few other questions, but I think James did mention in the chat that he'll do his best to work with Gohar to get some responses because I think it's been a really, really incredible chat. And I think there's a lot of questions that I would love to hear your perspective on as well, Gohar. So
Absolutely.
okay, so just wrapping up, really, I think everyone can agree that that was a fantastic presentation. I think everyone will look forward to getting the presentation itself when it's sent around. The recording, as we said, will be shared in coming days on the EAAA website and the YouTube channel. In terms of our next session, we're still looking in the details, so that will happen in May, but keep an eye out for an invite. And if you're not yet a member of EAAA and would like to know more about joining, please head to our website, eaaa.org.au, to learn more and join. And I'm going to use this last minute as a shameless plug for our EAAA Australian Elder Abuse Conference Stand Up Speak Out, which is happening on the 27th to the 29th of July up on the Gold Coast. It'll be 3 days of bringing together voices from community, legal, health, research and policy sectors to challenge harmful norms, which we've talked about a lot today, share knowledge and to drive real change for older Australians. So it's going to be more than a conference. It is going to be a national call to action. We do have a plan. Not quite sure on the funding, so I think there's a lot that we still need to resolve as a sector. We really encourage you to be part of the conversations shaping the response to elder abuse. You can visit conference.eaaa.org.au to look at the program, learn more about the event, and register to stand up and speak out with us in July. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to connecting you again in May. And again, Gohar, thank you so much. It's
Thanks.
incredible the work you do.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone.